Jahan with my very first Kerbal Space tutorial on Rendezvous. 3 methods. First is a direct transfer. The important aspects for if you find yourself in a situation sort of like this, where you just did a mission here, we picked up Claudette, but we want to transfer to the moon station here. We'll notice that our orbit is in an anti-equatorial direction, but the station is orbiting in an equatorial direction. So there's a very large relative speed difference to overcome here. So in order to do a direct transfer, we have to be at a small arc angle relative to the orbit, so it has to happen at a relatively small period of time, and we point halfway in between the target retrograde icon and the target icon on our nav ball. And sort of like magic, this will give us an intercept. I'll go over the math behind this at the end of the video. So again, where we're burning is halfway in between the relative target retrograde icon and the target position icon. And this only works if the arc length of the orbit that you're going through is short, because it relies upon a linear approximation of the sine angle over the orbit, because you get as the differences in your orbit drift, that'll cause errors in this particular approximation. But even with going anti-equatorial for a equatorial combination here, rendezvous, we can go ahead and perform this burn and get there. So now we just have to match relative speeds upon arrival. Now what we want is the target retrograde icon to overlap over the target anti-target icon. And the direction that we accelerate is going to push our retrograde indicator in the opposite direction from where we're pointed. So in order to match that up best, we go collinear on the opposite side of the anti-target icon and push the retrograde indicator to overlap the anti-target icon on the nav ball. And we look at the separation intersection and just do a slow burn until that's as close as we want. So as we're matching velocities and reducing our relative retrograde, we are also ensuring that we are keeping the separation distance at the intersect as small as possible. Now, as we approach, a technique to figure out exactly which side we're going to end up on the space station is to change the camera into a locked view and look down towards the engine facing the retrograde icon. That's the side that the craft is traveling on. Now you might notice there are a couple mods installed, one of which at the bottom is giving us this estimated burn and target distance time. That's the same information as the rendezvous in the map view. I believe that is added by CommunityResourcePack mod, but you can get the same information from the map view. And again, even once the relative velocities are closer, we continue to push the retrograde marker to overlap the anti-target in order to get the intercept to be overlapping. You do have to watch out for potential collisions. So as a general rule of thumb, you can take your relative speed and take the distance that you are from the craft and remove the last significant distance, and your target meters per second shouldn't be larger than that at any point in time. But here we are. We have achieved rendezvous, and we can go ahead and pick up the science that we were looking for. I'm going to rotate the hatch so it's pointing towards the station, so when I come back it's going to be on the side that I'm arriving to and from, and go pick up some science. So there we go, our first successful rendezvous, using the first method of just directly burning or directly transferring, when we can do so with a small portion of the orbit, a small arc length of the orbit. And we ended up with 1,627 meters per second left. And we'll go ahead and move on to the second method of rendezvousing. So this is going to be using the maneuver nodes in order to get a closer intercept before we match relative velocities. So we switch our target over to the station. We look at the ascending node and descending node. The descending node is closer to the orbit, so we're going to move the descending node to intercept, because that'll require a smaller burn than doing the other way around. So looking at the descending node, there's still a little tiny gap there. We'll modify that and try to get those to be crossing paths. And that looks pretty good. So there's our first maneuver, only 18.9 meters per second. There we go. Now that we're intercepting the orbit, we're going to place another maneuver node at the descending node where it's crossing. I'll wait till the station moves out of the way. And here we can see that the intercept has the station pretty far away currently, but we can wait until it's going to be closer. So that's pretty close. And that's even closer. So if we wait a full 9 days, we can do this maneuver separating it only 20 kilometers. Or if you need to go sooner, you can go with this earlier intercept and do the same maneuver. To show the relative efficiencies, we're going to take this closer one. And we just nudge the prograde or retrograde, respectively, to get those to overlap even closer. Now the relative speed is still pretty high. 838 meters per second relative speed. Now we can adjust the thrust limiter to perform a very, very small maneuver for this maneuver node. I always lock the engine view so that I remember to turn the thrust limiter back up after this is done. And I always remove the maneuver node a little bit before finishing the burn so that I can finish the burn manually, looking at the information in real time on the rendezvous node, the intersection. So now all that's left is to adjust for the relative speed difference of being in an opposite orbit from the station. We can estimate how big that is by taking the 800 or so meters per second at that maneuver, see what the burn was. It's 838. We could just type that in to get exact. And it estimates the burn time at 56 seconds. So we know that we'll need to start the burn a little bit less than that distance from the rendezvous. About half of that is the exact. But usually you want to give yourself a little bit more margin. And also, as we approach, we can use that extra velocity to fine-tune our approach, sort of like we did with the first approach on the direct burn. Now, at this point onwards, it's just the same as we did with the direct rendezvous. We want to get the retrograde marker of the target retrograde marker to overlap the anti-target icon. And we don't actually need the maneuver node for executing the maneuver. That was just to gauge the burn time necessary. And here it's giving us the 50% of the burn time. which is just the extended burn indicator, which you can turn on in the settings. Now the separation is creeping a little bit up, but we still have a lot of relative velocity to kill. So we're going to kill most of that, and then we're going to fine-tune the separation distance again with the last of the relative target velocity, trying to keep the relative retrograde marker overlapping the anti-target icon, which it's going to go directly away from wherever you're pointed, so be on the opposite side by a little bit. So we kept it pretty close to the anti-target icon there, only 0.2 kilometers. And again, we're on final approach. We do the same thing, keeping the R velocity slow enough, so under 50, under 40, under 30 at this point, according to the rule of thumb. Under 20, I'm a little bit above that here, there, for just a moment. And again, we have rendezvoused with the station. 0 meters per second difference. This time we have 1875 meters per second delta V remaining. So this was a little bit more fuel efficient than the direct method because we got a closer intercept, but we still had to deal with all of that, the equatorial and anti-equatorial. So the third method, we can exit the sphere of influence in order to change the direction that we're orbiting around the Mun. Now, if you're in a different location, you can use a moon to go around the moon to change your inclination, or any other change in sphere of influence to change your inclination. You'll get a cost savings because you won't have to have that dramatic high difference in relative velocity. So here again we're using maneuver nodes. Set up something to exit the sphere of influence. We don't want to get too far away from the Mun's orbit if we can help it, since we want to just intercept again. So this is taking 70 meters per second, a lot more than the 8 meters per second or 18 meters per second that the maneuver nodes was. You know, maybe 80. But it'll save us a lot of delta V in terms of correcting inclination, the complete opposite anti-equatorial orbit that we have versus the equatorial orbit that the station is going on. Just trying to get this to be close to an equatorial orbit after we exit. After we exit the sphere of influence of the Mun. This often takes a lot of fiddling around with the maneuver nodes to see which orbit is going to be best. And here I know I probably could do better, but this is just an example of using the sphere of influence to change your inclination if you have a large inclination change or a large amount of delta V dedicated for inclination change. Once we're outside of the sphere of influence, we of course need to find another intercept at some point. So again, using the ascending node and descending nodes, we don't need to correct the inclination in order to get an intercept here, but we can match the descending node to the orbit and go to different orbits until we get a close intercept. There, we got one. We'll make sure that that's in the direction we need. Yeah, and that's in an equatorial direction. And we can perform an inclination change halfway. So we'll do the first maneuver. And that showed us that we're going to get an intercept anyways. Oh, that's a little bit too far. But we'll start most of the way. We can do the change in inclination here, where it's going to be a relatively small burn. In comparison to what it would require if we were to do all the inclination change within Moon's sphere of influence. A lot of fiddling with the nodes to try to get the ascending node and descending node to have a very small inclination difference with the station. Now when we're doing our capture burn, we can simultaneously ensure that we get an intercept. Now we did most of our retrograde burn at periapsis where it's most efficient. And we'll do a minor change in inclination near the descending node here in order to get the intercept closer. And a little bit retrograde. And again, this final part is just the same as the first one, the direct approach. So we want to get the relative target retrograde marker lined up on the anti-target indicator, which is a linear approximation, which works when it's a small portion of the orbit and the rendezvous is going to occur in a short period of time. If you're further away, you again go halfway in between the retrograde and target icon for the most efficient intercept. But since we have to do a lot of velocity matching anyways, we do that pointing closer to the retrograde marker. And you can do the same thing with targeting any particular docking port. It changes where the icons are on your nav ball, and you can adjust your approach accordingly. This particular craft doesn't have a docking port because it didn't need a dock, but there we go. And we end up with 2212 meters per second left over. So performing any inclination changes outside of the sphere of influence is going to be the most efficient in most instances, especially with something where you're equatorial and anti-equatorial. If you're just orbiting over Gilly or Minmus, then it might not matter that much. And next we'll go over the math. So this is with the linearization of the orbit looking at the relative velocities. So the linear approximation first only works if you're dealing with a small arc length of the orbit. Otherwise the orbital drift is going to be too big of a factor for this to work. But our approach is going to pass somewhere past the target, fixing the target at the origin position. And there's going to be some amount of gap, and we know that the closest approach, taking that normal and comparing it to where we currently are, we see that the desired path we have is towards the target, and then there's the anti-target position, and halfway between the relative retrograde and the target position is always going to move our current prograde towards the target position when we burn halfway between the relative target and the target. Now, a couple other things with this. You can improve this linear approximation by taking effectively a first derivative. If you look at your nav ball and look at where your target retrograde is and time warp like ×5 for a short period and see how your relative retrograde target marker moves, you can account for the orbital drift a little bit to improve the linear estimation into effectively kind of taking into account the first derivative. But a tiny amount of error is actually good, because if you don't have any error as you approach, you can actually run into the problem of collisions, so you don't want that. Also, any error caused by orbital drift, which is in the direction of the burn, doesn't really matter, because that only affects the magnitude of the burn required, and we're looking at the intercept information directly on the map in real time to tell us what magnitude of the burn to do. Then, as a final remark, in order to ensure that the arc length of the rendezvous is small, you want at least 6 meters per second difference per about kilometer or so to ensure that there's a close closing time and that the arc length is small if you're going to use this direct approach and the linear approximation involved with that. Otherwise, you're better off using the maneuver nodes. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like and share. This has been Jay Han with the Kerbal Space Tutorial.